See, all of my examples that I've shared are simple. Most of them are even silly. But if we live our lives for our preferences in the small things, we will begin to live for our preference in the large things. We will begin to think that if it's what I want, it's what I deserve. And if it's what I deserve, it's what I should have. And we stop thinking about the plan of God or even the people around us. And we wonder, how do we get to these places? They all start with preference. A preference to live among people like us leads to a prejudice against those who are different from us. And then that prejudice leads to unrighteousness, and unrighteousness always leads to injustice. We don't begin with injustice, we begin with preference. But when our preference goes unchecked, you can be sure we will end up in injustice. I'm going to tell you something I wasn't sure I was going to tell you. It's just a little bit about me, about who I am and where I come from. I hope that you'll receive it the way that I share it, but it's about what preference becomes if we're not careful. I've lived in Burlington for 25 years now. This is where I am called. This is where I love. This is home. It used to drive my dad nuts when I would be visiting him and say, I got to go home. He's like, this is home. Like, it's been a long time since that was home. But what I didn't know, after I'd already lived here a long time and God had birthed things in my heart and He had shaped me into who He wanted me to be, I didn't really know where I had come from. See, my grandparents had immigrated from the Ukraine, met in New York City, and lived in Bayonne, New Jersey. So I didn't know how we ended up in Virginia. And some years ago, I went home to preach for a family funeral because that's kind of what my role in the family is now, as weird as that sounds. And my dad said to me, do you even know why we moved from New Jersey to Virginia now that you're back in New Jersey? I said, no, I've never heard that story. He said, your grandfather, as my older siblings, because my dad was born in Virginia, as my older siblings were getting ready for school, your grandfather preferred to find a place where schools were not integrated, where his children could go to school with, in his words, people like them. He mentioned this to someone he worked with on the railroad. That man on the railroad said, I've got 50 acres in Virginia if you want it, bought it sight unseen. Because his preference had already started to become unrighteous, and his unrighteousness was leading him to injustice. Guys, we wonder, how did we get to these places of racism? How did we get to these places of abortion? How did we get to these places of economic divisions? How did we get to these places where we're now so divided we can't even talk to each other? It all started with somebody's preference. Where somebody decided I would rather have this for me without thinking of what it would cost someone else. And ran with their preference until it led to unrighteousness, and then their unrighteousness, because remember, what is righteousness? It means equity. Yes. And so the inequity always becomes injustice. We have to guard our hearts. We have to watch our lives, because if we are living for ourselves, we will stop living for Christ, and we will start stepping on everybody else.